Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another edition of our Justice and Peace's guest speaker series. As we've been talking to lawyer and paralegal bencher candidates, as always, the views and opinions are of the candidates alone. They don't reflect me, Justice and Peace's, Trials College, or any other education institution or organization that I'm affiliated with. Continuing our series today, we have Elliot joining us. So first of all, thanks, Elliot, for taking the time to speak with me.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
And Elliot, maybe we can get started. You can tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Well, my name's Elliot Saccucci. I'm in my 10th year of practice. I'm a partner at Loopster Nixon LLP in Toronto, so I'm running inside Toronto. I head up our employment and sports law groups, so I'm a bit unique in that I've got a fairly heavy sports practice, and I'm a sort of a litigator and arbitrator in the sport and employment space.
And so what brings you into the bencher election? Why are you running for bencher this time?
Well, yeah, so to be clear, I've never run before. This is my first crack at the board of directors of the Law Society. I think what actually got me started was the mandatory pay for articling students debate. And if you recall, last year, members of the bar were invited to provide commentary on that issue. And what struck me was that it was such a simple issue. And I couldn't believe that we were revisiting something that had been decided previously by convocation, which was that articling students needed to be paid, as do any other students, generally speaking, under the Employment Standards Act. So I thought that was, shocking. And then I started to think about some of the issues that were going on in convocation, and having sort of publicly commented on the issue and provided my commentary. I started to look more at what the benchers are up to and what they're doing, and I thought, rather than sort of chirp from the cheap seats, I'd enter the fray and see if I couldn't be involved in those sort of decisions.
So, I mean, it's certainly a unique election this time around, right? You have the Full Stop team, you have the Good Governance Coalition, and then you have, I think we were trying to do the math there, but
something like 17 independents in Toronto, and then a number outside of Toronto. Yeah, so you've got the electoral region of outside Toronto, which is a bit geographically unfair, and then you've got inside, and you've got 20 from each. And the two coalitions or slates, I think the Good Governance has got enough candidates in both. They could essentially have all the seats in convocation. If I remember correctly, the Full Stop slate has 16 inside Toronto, meaning that theoretically you could have them and some other candidates. And then there's almost enough independents in Toronto to fill convocation, and I think almost enough outside of Toronto to fill convocation. So it's a really interesting setup, but one that's been framed sort of as dichotomous. It's been framed as you've got this slate and this slate, and you take your pick, when in fact there are a number of completely unaffiliated candidates like myself who are running their own little campaign in the hopes that people like what we're talking about and want to elect us as individuals.
Yeah. So how do you sort of feel there? I know even with events that it tends to be let's bring in some people from the Full Stop group, let's bring in some people from the Good Governance group, and let's throw in a bone to Elliot or whoever is.
Yeah.
So how do you think sort of getting maybe, and we'll get into your message and what you want to talk about in a second, but just getting out there in this election? I mean, it never used to be like that, right? I mean, everyone would have their spiel. You'd read the guide. There may be some meet and greet type events, but it was generally everyone for themselves type of thing, right? And whoever you knew, you ended up voting for, I guess, or reading about. But what do you find challenging this time? I mean,
well, it's interesting. Convocation and the election of convocation and the benchers, I don't think ever contemplated a party system or slates or however you want to term them politically. And there's very little guidance in the bylaw about how candidates are to run their own campaigns. And there's nothing that goes one way or the other in terms of slates. I think there's an obvious advantage to be had where you've got a group of like-minded individuals, and provided somebody as a voter agrees with the premise of one candidate they know, and then you go down a list and you see all the other ones that are affiliated, obviously it's a lot easier to garner votes that way as opposed to being an independent. For people that don't really know the rules around the election, you can vote for up to 20 candidates in either Toronto or outside Toronto. So you get 20 here and 20 there. You don't need to cast them all. But this election is being framed as one where it's like, well, you need to cast all 16 here or all 20 there and use them all up and fill the slate. In fact, that's not the reality of the thing. I mean, I intend, if I'm elected, to vote my conscience. I very much hope that the voters that are voting in the election vote theirs. If you know sort of the history of bencher elections, they get low voter turnout. Like the last election had 16,000 and change voters, and they can vote for up to 20 people. So if you actually look at the people that are getting votes, you're getting in with a few thousand votes at sort of the top end, and then a couple thousand at the bottom end, and it's actually really close together. But there's no obligation to vote your 20 for a slate or your 16 for a slate. You can vote for however many candidates you want, up to a maximum of 20. So where does that leave us as independents? Well, it's obviously more challenging in a number of ways. In terms of, if you look at the coalitions, they're able to marshal their resources and their message. So you've got more money behind them in terms of the candidates. I'm a little bit privileged in that my firm has been supportive of my run, and so I've been able to put some ads in the Ontario reports, and I've got a little website, elliottforbencher.com. Rudimentary as it is, I do have a website. And so I'm very lucky in that way. But as an independent candidate, it's much harder to do that than if you are a coalition. And a number of these coalitions are big downtown lawyers, right? They've got resources that they can pool together and networks that they can pool to get elected. And then to your point about sort of events, typically at an event, you've got enough space for a representative of each slate and then perhaps one or two independents. And that means that you've got 17 people vying for airtime in Toronto in maybe one or two slots, but you've got 36 people between the two slates that are represented in one or two slots. And so there's an obvious advantage in terms of messaging. So for independent candidates, it's a lot tougher. You're pounding your individual networks. For me, it's LinkedIn. I'm trying to constantly reinform, my network about what it is that I'm trying to do and why, and hopefully it resonates. But ultimately, if voter turnout is low, chances are you're going to get one slate or the other, because all of that is going to go to one of those two slates, right? The more votes you have, the better chance you have of electing independents. And so by and large, I think if the independents are thinking about it like I am strategically, let's just get people to vote. Now, let the chips fall where they may, but the more people that vote, the more likely you are to have benchers and convocation that represent the bar at large. And I think that's, that is both the challenge, but the goal as well.
Now, you mentioned some issues, things that you wanted to bring into convocation there. So perhaps you can tell us a little bit more of what some of those issues are that you'd like to bring up at the board of directors meetings and hope to see at the Law Society.
Yeah, so I mean, I've laid out my platform on my website. It's elliottforbencher.com, and there's really like three pillars, and they've been appearing sort of in the ORs as the weeks go by. I think pillar 2 is up this week, but there's three sort of broad pillars that I think are really important for the Law Society. Like, keeping in mind what it is. The Law Society is the regulator of the legal profession, and we're privileged in that we're self-regulated. And the mandate is to protect the public. Like, that's really what we are. And under that, I think it's really important to focus on things like, access to justice. And for me, that's talking about expanding mandatory mediation, for instance, in Ontario, and advocating for that to the government, using the platform of the Law Society to do that. I think that's really important. I mean, there's so many litigants that wait years to have a determination of their matter, when we know that mediation will wrap things up 99% of the time early. And as you know, justice delayed is justice denied. So I think it's incumbent on the LSO to take a stand and advocate for that. The issue of equity, diversity, and inclusion is one that's been really bandied about, both as a sword and a shield kind of, an attack. And then also, I approach the issue a little bit differently. Like, I look at the fact that the profession is evolving and the way people practice is evolving. And when I look at convocation and the Law Society and things it needs to do in the public interest, I see things like support for foreign trained lawyers. We have more and more people coming to Canada that are lawyers that want to practice, that should be able to practice. And we need to figure out how to get those people practicing. We should be looking at helping new solo and small practitioners. As I study the legal landscape, more and more people are practicing in smaller silos. Virtual practice has allowed people to service markets that are far away. And so I'm looking at the Law Society to investigate, how do we get NCA and foreign trained lawyers practicing? How do we look at expanding outreach for new and solo and small practitioners? And as I mentioned, I view the articling issue, the mandatory pay one, as being part of this issue. If there are systemic barriers to people practicing, not paying them is certainly one of them. And so in 2026, that mandate of paying minimum wage to articling students comes up again. If I'm elected, I'm going to work tirelessly to ensure that that's the end of that debate, that articling students must be paid. And one of the reasons I'm running is to try to bring an outsider's perspective. And I'm a first-time candidate, probably a bit of a non-traditional one. I'm not a big Bay Street lawyer. I think it's really important to keep convocation current. So I'd like to see more involvement from practitioners under the 10-year call. I would like to see reduced term limits. So I want to see 2 terms, and then that's it. Currently it's 3. 12 years of one perspective, I think, is too long for a regulator. I think there should be encouraging more active involvement in that, new, fresh voices and perspectives. So that's really what I'm about. And I'm hoping that resonates with people. I think it's a pragmatic approach to what a regulator is and should do. And if I get in, those will be my priorities.
All right, so let's unpack those. And then let's go back to, I think first you mentioned try to bring in mandatory mediation more. And I hope my ADR students are listening, because that was actually a question on their exam about sort of the concept of mandatory mediation, right? In terms of, is it effective and how can it be effective? Because you're essentially being forced into going into the mediation aspect of it. So in terms of the Law Society's role, in terms of being a bencher, what areas would you sort of suggest that they can look into this more, and what can the Law Society be doing? I mean, obviously it's ultimately going to be up to the courts and tribunals to kind of incorporate it.
Yeah, ultimately it falls to the Attorney General to decide whether the pilot project that's now 20 years old rolls out beyond Windsor, Ottawa, and Toronto. There's been fantastic work done on research, like white papers on mandatory mediation and its efficacy, done by the Ontario Bar Association, has done a recent study on this. All of the empirical evidence that we could ever need to advocate exists. So what does it look like for the benchers? It's purely using the voice, or elected voice, on behalf of the bar to advocate to the Attorney General that this ought to be done. This is, everyone recognizes, including the Attorney General, that there are systemic issues in terms of accessing justice right now. And some of them are very costly fixes. We need more judges. That is an expensive fix. And while it's a necessary fix, it should be a slam dunk to institute mandatory mediation across the province. It already exists in 3 major markets. It's had, 2 decades-ish of incredible success. The research exists. It's purely an advocacy role for the convocation to say to the AG, there's no excuse not to do this. The will of the profession is that it ought to be done. We know it works. Let's get going, and this will patch some of the holes that exist in our judicial system. But I'm a huge proponent of ADR. I'm an employment lawyer, and virtually everything that we do is resolved, before or at that juncture. We have a relatively expedient system of justice within our bar, because a lot of the bar works collaboratively to bring about solutions. And I just, we know that when 2 parties are forced into a situation where they're able to craft a solution, they do. Ultimately, most people, that's what they want. It's the 1% of litigants require their day in court. Most just want a resolution and to move on.
So the second pillar there, I think, and certainly you were talking about that kind of got you interested more into the bencher elections, there is the whole pay and articling and barriers for those like NCA students and those coming in, internationally trained lawyers. Now, I mean, there is the point of, well, if people have to pay, they may not take on articling students, and that'll create a further bottleneck in terms of people not getting through that process to get licensed. So I know you've given this quite a lot of thought, but what would you say in terms of ending the debate? But what else can the Law Society be doing to sort of help in that transition? again, as maybe more and more internationally trained lawyers, or even Canadians going to or going from like university here, going to law school overseas, and then coming back, right? That how would we look at kind of finding a better fix for articling and minimum wage and everything like that?
So I think you've hit upon a couple different issues there, JP. The issue of certainly of people coming here with foreign legal education and wanting to practice is one issue. The mandatory pay for articling students is another. They're interrelated perhaps, but when I look at sort of foreign trained lawyers coming here in the NCA process for practice, I find it mystifying why there appears to be little uptake relative to the number of NCA potential candidates into firms. And I don't just mean from all over the world. I mean, there are American trained lawyers that come here. There are internationally trained lawyers that come here. And when I look around at sort of peers in the legal profession, they don't seem to show up as readily as the statistics would bear out. What is the solution to that? I actually don't have the answer. And so my proposal is that there ought to be a task force created to investigate what the barriers are. Like, where are they in our process that is preventing them? What is the systemic issue? Because I don't have all the answers, and I haven't seen a great deal of study on that. And I do read about that issue quite a bit as it comes up. I haven't seen any definitive answer about what is preventing those types of candidates. But I think because we are a regulator that is obligated to uphold the public interest, part of that is ensuring that there are not undue barriers to entry to the profession for people coming from certain communities. And so it's incumbent upon us to figure out what those barriers are. So that's, in terms of addressing that, I think a task force ought to be struck to investigate that very issue and then make recommendations about what changes are necessary. In terms of mandating pay for articling students, I mean, that issue was settled after intense study 2 convocations ago. The research was done, the determination was made, and then as far as the most recent convocation, again, there's a cohort of members of the Law Society that turned that on its head, or of the convocation, and said, well, that'll present a barrier because people will have to pay articling students. It was a settled issue. Like the investigation was done, that was thoroughly debunked. It is a far greater barrier to accessing justice and creating a systemic barrier for non-traditional law candidates to not pay them. That prevents them from coming, because they've had to pay their way through school. That prevents them from entering the profession far more than does denying them a free training. Like, that is, it's a bit of a shell game to suggest otherwise. If you want to take on an articling student, you're obliged to pay them. Any other employee under the Employment Standards Act is guaranteed, in Ontario, is guaranteed minimum wage. So if every other business can figure that out, so can we as a profession, and a relatively privileged one. If you can't afford the articling student, you don't take one on. I mean, that is all there is to it. And to suggest, as I've said, to suggest otherwise is truly a shell game.
Yeah, so I mean, then if there are those who are struggling, or there's maybe not enough articling opportunities. I know there's the LPP program, for example, or looking at other ways to get through this process. And again, you may not necessarily have all the answers at this point, but I mean, is there anything else in terms of looking to get through that barrier or that obstacle, if for those people who are struggling to find articling positions, if not let's say it's unrelated to the issue of pay, but just going through that process, what else can be done from the Law Society
in terms of creating more opportunity for training? Well, I think the LPP program was an attempt to address that very issue, because there simply weren't enough positions to fill the number of students being cranked out by law schools. The issue is one that there is no clear answer on. What I can tell you is that the answer isn't to make worse opportunities available for already distressed students. And so I know I'm dancing around the question a little bit, but there isn't a clear one. I know what the answer is not. I think it requires some study in order to figure out what the answer is. And relatedly, another one of the endeavors I support is looking at law school tuition and studying that as a barrier to accessing the profession, and thus, a public interest issue. And so if you're able to, on the one hand, look at that, and figure out how that issue is creating a barrier, it's easier to then study the system more holistically in terms of where people start and where they end up in the profession. But I don't know one clear issue. It's a very complex issue, JP, and I like to consider myself someone that is open to perspectives of others. And at convocation, if I'm elected, but one voice, and it's incumbent upon me to talk to the rest of the benchers in convocation to figure out how do we, as a board, set strategy to deal with these issues. Who must we consult with, and how do we, move forward? And my promise to the electorate is that I will do that. Not that I have the answers today.
Yeah, and you bring that point up there, right? I mean, ultimately, we're voting as lawyers, right? Whether it's inside or outside Toronto, we have 40 votes, 20 and 20.
Yeah.
And whoever gets elected is one voice, as you said, of 53, right? The 40 lawyer benchers, the 5 paralegal, the 8 lay benchers.
Yes.
And again, in the public mandate. And then in this election, right, there can be all sorts of combinations, right? It could be almost entirely one coalition or one team or slate or a mix of the two of them. And how is one voice and kind of getting all of this, especially when you know there's a lot of messaging, right? That's kind of, if you've got to vote for us and not them, and then half and half could be sitting there with yourself, and now we're going through all these issues. And what's Elliot going to do in terms of, let's say, articling, or in terms of mandatory mediation, or any other issue that we haven't talked about, in terms of getting the board to function cohesively?
Well, I think that is unfortunately one of the advantages that the slates have. It's a self-perpetuating advantage, right? Because they can say, like, what is any one independent going to do to make convocation work in the face of one of these two or both slates? What can one, board of director member? Ultimately, you're voting for an amalgam of independents, and maybe they band together, maybe they don't, but they all have the same voice at convocation. And I think if the electorate truly gets involved and shows up to the tune of more than 1 in 3, there's not one independent Elliot with one voice sandwiched between two slates. I'm hoping that there's really 40 benchers that all have their own conscience to vote. In terms of me and what I can promise, if I'm elected, regardless of who else is elected, I'm going to vote my conscience. I'm going to stand up for the very things that I've put on my website and publicly stated are my priorities. And I'm going to work tirelessly to get those done. Yes, I only have one vote, and I will certainly work diligently to try to get the other votes I need. But I'm hoping that if my platform is something that resonates, then other similarly minded, candidates will be elected, and that task, will be easier. But ultimately, we're a board of directors. We're not the operational arm of the Law Society. Some of the stuff that you're seeing discussed by, the coalitions is minutia and granular and operational, and ought not to be the day-to-day functioning of a board. We're a strategic and governance body. It should be easier, I would think, to agree on large-scale strategic governance issues than it would be about line items, about dollars spent. And I really hope that convocation doesn't continue to descend down into that minutia, because it's not a rule. There are people that are qualified and compensated to do just that for the Law Society, and it isn't convocation.
Now, Elliot, is there anything else, that we haven't touched on that you think is important for anyone that is listening, anyone who's voting, especially, getting the votes out, as you mentioned, is important, regardless of where they may go, but anything more you want to highlight in terms of your background and why you're running here as for the bencher position?
Look, I want to reiterate it first and foremost. I just want to see people vote. And ideally, I would ask my colleagues, my friends at the bar, to inform themselves as much as possible. Like, I've got a 1-page, 3-pillar infographic. If you want to know what I stand for, it's there. A lot of other candidates do as well. Inform yourself and vote. Take the opportunity to help shape this profession and to help shape what self-regulation looks like, and hopefully continues to look like. That's my number one ask. In terms of voting for me, I think for those that know me, I am a mix of principled and pragmatic. I believe in what I say, and I stand up for what I believe in, but I'm also here to ensure that the Law Society and convocation continues to work. If you want to see, a functioning self-regulator, that's what I'm there to do. I'm not there to redefine what it is that a regulator is. I am there to make sure that we get the job done well and we continue to protect the public, because that is the job. And if that resonates with you, then I really hope, as an independent candidate, every person that decides to go on and vote for me is extra important, because I don't have, the banner to sort of raise. So I really hope that people take the time to come out and vote for this little campaign. And I promise I won't let you down.
Elliot, last couple of questions here. I have students hopefully listening, especially because you mentioned a couple of things that we've been talking about in ADR there.
Yeah.
But what advice do you have? Again, we've looked at articling and NCAs, and any students that's looking to kind of get into the profession. Any advice you have for them as they make their leap into their legal career?
I think it's really, really important to always be looking for that thing in law that interests you. Law is look, it's well publicized and increasingly well publicized. This is a difficult profession. There are a ton of demands on your personal life. It can be difficult on people's mental health. It's very important as a young lawyer to try to find that thing that interests you, that keeps you passionate about it, that keeps you, on those really hard days where you're like, I don't know if I really want to do this, to be like, yes, but there's this thing that I'm so passionate about. For me, that was getting involved in sport law. And, I started right away. Like I showed up to law school and I wasn't sure exactly what it was going to look like, but I knew the arena, quote unquote, pun intended, that I wanted to be in, to try to, draw what I could that I was passionate about. And I think that is so important. And it's important because it's important not to lose your interests in law too, which is point number 2. This career can be all consuming. And it's important to have your professional interests, but also be able to maintain, those personal ones. And if it has overlap, as it does for me, all the better, right? Because you're carving out space in your professional life and maintaining space in your personal to have this thing, these interests outside of just showing up, billing your hours, and and trying to advance up the the legal ladder, as it were. And I think it's really important to have friends outside the law, because at least in my experience, lawyers have a nasty habit of talking about, like, they default to talking about the law if there's silence, and it's really nice to just be grounded in topics outside of what is an all-consuming profession at times. So, try to keep those interests, try to keep your friends from outside law, and try to find something in law that you're truly passionate about that will keep you coming back when the demands are otherwise, so great that you're like, do I really want to do this? And that really, I'm 10 years in, so I don't have, the answers of a 50-year call, but that's what's been, what's kept me sane and in law, as long as I've been doing it, and still hopeful enough about the future to want to, sit on our regulator and try to steer governance issues.
And last question there, for any of the lawyers that are listening and they've made it through to the 30-minute mark here, why should they cast one of their 40 votes for you, Elliot?
Well, as I said, I think it goes back to, I am a both principled and pragmatic person. I believe that this is a inherently good and service-oriented profession. I genuinely believe that. I think the convocation has a very important and special responsibility in self-regulation. It's a responsibility that I take seriously, and I promise that if elected on the basis of my platform, I will stick to it. And, you have my word. I will do everything I can to make sure that these priorities continue to be the priorities of convocation moving forward, and I will work tirelessly to see convocation work as effectively in the public interest as possible.
Perfect. So, Elliot, thanks once again for taking the time to talk to us, and thanks for everyone for tuning in. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, JP. Take care.